On the 17th of February 2021, a small team of scientists in Stockholm published a paper in the journal Nature. It quietly broke something that scientists had said was impossible for years. The team had pulled genetic material out of 3 old teeth dug up from the frozen ground in Siberia. When they figured out how old the DNA was, the numbers did not make sense at first. Not 30,000 years old, not 200,000 years old. One of those teeth held DNA from an animal that lived about 2 million years ago. To understand how old that is 1,000 times older than the age of the Vikings. It is so old that it comes from before modern humans and Neanderthals even existed as separate groups. Nobody in that lab thought DNA, which is a very fragile molecule, could survive that long. But there it was, sitting in a fridge in Sweden, waiting to be studied. A tiny piece of tooth had survived ice ages, moving continents, and the rise and fall of entire species. They were dug out of the ground in northeastern Siberia in the early 1970s by a Russian scientist named Andrei Scher. He was seen as one of the top experts in mammoth research. Scher looked specifically in parts of the frozen ground that he knew just from the rock layers were very old. Between 1971 and 1976, he pulled 3 separate mammoth teeth out of 3 different riverbanks in the same remote part of Siberia. One came from the bank of the Bolshaya Chukoya River in 1971. One came from a gravel bar on the Adicha River in 1976. One came from a cliff next to the Krestovka River in 1973. At the time, he only gave them simple field labels and packed them away. He had no idea that decades later they would help rewrite a piece of evolutionary history. He never got to see any of this, since he passed away years before the technology existed to read DNA this old. In 2017, those 3 teeth landed on the desk of a young researcher named Tom van der Waal. He worked at the Center for Paleogenetics in Stockholm. The original plan was fairly simple, just to compare mammoth genetics from before and after the woolly mammoth evolved. The same woolly mammoth everyone recognizes from Ice Age documentaries. Nobody on the team expected to break a world record, pulling usable DNA out of a fossil. This old is more like putting together a shredded piece of paper than reading a full page. The genetic material inside each tooth had broken down into millions of tiny pieces. Some pieces were as short as 35 letters of code. Those tiny pieces were mixed in with DNA from every germ, plant, and passing animal that had touched the tooth over nearly 50 years of storage and handling since Shore first dug it up. To sort through this mess, the team used the already known genetic code of living African and Asian elephants as a guide, sort of like the picture on the front of a puzzle box. This let a computer program sort through billions of tiny DNA pieces and figure out which ones actually came from a mammoth and which ones were just contamination. It took weeks of computer work just to put together something the team could actually study. There's also a clever trick built into truly ancient DNA. It let the team prove these DNA pieces were real and not just modern contamination from someone's fingers. As DNA breaks down over tens of thousands of years, one of its basic chemical building blocks, called cytosine, tends to change into a different one called uracil. This change happens in a very specific pattern, and it shows up mostly near the broken ends of each DNA piece. Fresh DNA from a living cell does not carry the same pattern of damage. So when scientists see that exact pattern spread across millions of pieces of DNA, it works like a built-in age certificate. It is a kind of chemical proof that the material really has been sitting in the ground for an enormous amount of time, rather than being contamination from something as simple as a lab worker's lunch. All 3 mammoth teeth carried this damage pattern at levels that matched and in some cases went beyond anything scientists had ever recorded before. That is part of why the team felt confident enough to publish ages nobody had dared claim before. What came out of all this work reset the whole scale of what scientists thought was possible in this field. The youngest of the 3 teeth was nicknamed Chukochia after the river it came from. It turned out to be an early woolly mammoth about 700,000 years old. Even at that age, researchers managed to recover between 70 and 80% of its full genetic code, which is an incredible amount of detail for something this old. The second tooth, called Adicha, was dated to roughly 1 million years old. It turned out to be a steppe mammoth, the classic ancestor species that scientists had long assumed gave rise to the woolly mammoth. Researchers recovered about A4 to a third of its genetic code. And the third tooth, called Christoph, the one that had been sitting in a Siberian cliff the longest, came back dated to about 2 million years old. This is where things stopped making sense in the way anyone expected. Before this study, scientists had never managed to reliably read DNA from anything older than roughly 700 to 800,000 years. That record belonged to a fossil horse leg bone dug out of frozen ground in Canada's Yukon Territory back in 2013. It was studied by many of the same scientists working in this same small, tight-knit area of genetics. The scientist, who had held that record for almost a decade, a genetics expert named Ludwig Orlando, said afterward that he had been waiting years for someone to finally beat it. He described the news less like losing a competition and more like relief that the whole field had finally moved forward again. This new mammoth data did not just slightly beat that old record, it very nearly doubled it in a single study. A jump so big that some scientists outside the project openly admitted they thought this kind of result would not be possible in their own lifetimes. But the age of the DNA was not even the most interesting part of this discovery. When the team tried to figure out exactly where the Christopha mammoth fit on the mammoth family tree, the genetic data simply refused to match anything they expected. Based on how the tooth looked, it seemed like a steppe mammoth, similar to Adichia, but its DNA told a completely different story. It belonged to a lineage that had split off. It had gone its own separate way more than 2 million years earlier, a branch of the mammoth family that nobody studying mammoth fossils had ever identified before. For a while, the researchers were genuinely stuck. They ran the numbers again and again, assuming they had made some kind of mistake, because the results simply did not fit any existing model of how mammoths evolved. Then they compared Christopha's genetic signature to already known DNA from Columbian mammoths. These were the huge mammoths that lived in warmer climates, roaming as far south as Mexico and Central America, very different from the famous cold-weather woolly mammoths that stuck to the Arctic. And suddenly the pieces clicked into place. The Columbian mammoth was not simply a descendant of the steppe mammoth lineage like everyone had assumed. It was a hybrid, a genuine mix of two different mammoth lines made up of roughly 50% Griffka DNA and 50% woolly mammoth DNA. One of the senior scientists on the study later described that moment plainly. He said it took hours of discussion among the team before anyone was willing to accept what the numbers were actually telling them. Nothing in the existing fossil record had ever hinted that two mammoth lines, separated by well over 1 million years of evolving apart, could still successfully breed together and create a whole new population large enough to spread across an entire continent. Sometime around 420,000 years ago, probably somewhere in North America or on the land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska, two separate mammoth lineages met, bred, and produced a brand new species that would go on to take over the warmer parts of an entire continent. A mystery that had puzzled mammoth researchers for years. Why the Columbian mammoth seemed to sit in such a strange in-between spot on the family tree was finally solved by DNA pulled from a tooth that had been sitting in a drawer since before most of the research team had even been born. Once the shock of that discovery settled down, the researchers realized they had proven something much bigger than just one mammoth family tree. If usable, readable DNA could survive well enough to be studied after 1. 2 million years, then the old assumptions about how long genetic material could last were simply wrong. Scientists had generally treated anything older than about 500,000 years as a lost cause. Suddenly, that limit had nearly tripled overnight, and researchers started openly wondering how much further back it might be possible to go. The frozen ground itself, the deep permafrost of the Siberian Arctic, only goes back about 6 million years to the start of the ice ages in the early Plian period. That number purely by chance might actually represent the real theoretical limit for how old DNA could ever be recovered from a frozen environment, simply because there is no older permafrost left anywhere on the planet to search through. Scientists studying this mammoth breakthrough openly said that this limit, whatever it turns out to be exactly, is now a lot closer than anyone believed it could be before February of 2021. This is where the story stops being only about mammoths and starts becoming a story about us. That is, because the search for the oldest possible DNA has direct and sometimes uncomfortable effects on how much we can ever hope to learn about our own species' deep past. DNA breaks down through normal chemical decay, and how fast that happens depends heavily on temperature and moisture. Cold, dry, stable places, like permafrost or certain caves, can keep genetic material intact for hundreds of thousands of years or more. Warm, wet places destroy it much faster, often within just a few thousand years, sometimes even less. And here's the uncomfortable part for anyone hoping to trace the deep genetic history of humans specifically. Most of human evolution did not happen in Siberia. It happened in Africa across warm and often humid land, which is exactly the kind of place where DNA breaks down the fastest. This means that purely by an accident of climate and geography, scientists currently know more about the genetic code of A1, 2 million-year-old mammoth from Siberia, than they will probably ever know about any human ancestor who lived and died in Africa during that same stretch of time. The animals that happened to die somewhere cold got to keep their secrets locked in ice for us to eventually read. Most of our own ancestors never got that same lucky accident of preservation, no matter how important their genes turned out to be for our own story. That does not mean research into ancient human DNA has been standing still. In fact, the closest human equivalents to this mammoth story are almost as amazing, and some of them followed almost exactly the same pattern, an unexpected and completely unknown lineage hiding inside old bones. The current record holder for the oldest confirmed DNA from a human relative does not come from Siberian permafrost at all. It comes from a cave in northern Spain called Semadeos, which roughly translates to the pit of bones. Researchers there recovered DNA from a tooth and a thigh bone belonging to an ancient human species that lived somewhere between 300,000 and 430,000 years ago. This was published in 2016 by the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. The cave itself turned out to be the reason this preservation was even possible, even without any permafrost at all. It kept a remarkably steady temperature of around 5 to 10 degrees C, with very little air moving through it, acting like a natural refrigerator rather than a freezer, based purely on the shape of the bones. Scientists had already guessed these individuals were early Neanderthals, and the DNA mostly agreed with that. But the small piece of DNA passed down through the mother's line, called mitochondrial DNA, held an unexpected twist. It showed a closer connection to the Denisovans, a group whose remains at that point had only ever been found 4,000 talos away in Siberia. One of the researchers involved admitted afterward that the result simply did not match what anyone expected, and in his own words was hard to make sense of. It raised the possibility that these individuals either lived before Neanderthals and Denisovans split into two separate groups, or that some entirely separate and still unknown ancient human group had passed genetic material into both lineages at some point even further back in time. In 2010, researchers pulled DNA from a tiny piece of fingerbone found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. That cave already had a name from earlier archaeological digs, Denisova Cave. Nobody could have guessed from the fragment alone what it actually represented, because it was barely even big enough to identify as human just by looking at it. But its DNA revealed an entirely new group of ancient humans, now called Denisovans, who were neither modern humans nor Neanderthals, but a separate, previously unknown branch of our own family tree. To this day, we know about them almost entirely through their genetic code, rather than through any recognizable fossils. In almost every meaningful way, this is the human version of the Christoph mammoth story. A lineage that existed and mattered, yet stayed completely invisible to science until DNA testing finally went back far enough to find it hiding in a bone nobody had thought twice about. And just like with the mammoths, once scientists actually started reading the genetic code of our ancient relatives, an old assumption fell apart. Scientists used to believe that modern humans simply and cleanly replaced older human species without any interbreeding at all. That turned out to be wrong. Genetic testing of Neanderthal DNA showed that modern humans and Neanderthals did interbreed, most likely around 50 to 60,000 years ago, as our species spread out of Africa and ran into Neanderthal groups already living across Europe and Asia. But the real story turned out to be even messier than just one meeting. A separate genetic study published in 2016 looked at Neanderthal DNA recovered from Siberia's Altai region, along with samples from Spain and Croatia. It found evidence of interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals stretching back roughly 100,000 years, much earlier than the main wave of migration out of Africa that most textbooks describe. This suggests that there were several separate waves of contact and interbreeding between our species and Neanderthals spread out across tens of thousands of years, not just one tidy meeting. Today, most people whose family history traces outside Africa carry somewhere around 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA in their own genetic code, which actively affects things like immune system responses and the risk of certain modern diseases. Denisovan left an even bigger genetic mark in some groups of people, especially in parts of Asia and the Pacific Islands, where some populations carry several percent Denisovan ancestry, again affecting biological traits that scientists can still measure in living people today. In other words, our species did not simply outcompete and wipe out these other branches of humanity the way older textbooks used to confidently explain it. We absorbed them over and over through multiple separate encounters spread across tens of thousands of years. And small pieces of them are quite literally still walking around inside millions of people today, whether those people know it or not. There is an even stranger extension of the same idea, one that has nothing to do with bones at all. In 2021, a separate team working at that very same Denisova cave extracted DNA not from any fossil, but from the dirt on the cave floor itself. They studied more than 700 separate samples of sediment in total and lined them up against a carefully rebuilt timeline of the cave's many layers. It turns out that human cells and body fluids can leave behind traceable genetic material in the ground long after any bones have either rotted away or simply were never left behind in the first place. That sediment study let researchers build a detailed layer-by-layer timeline of exactly which ancient human groups occupied that single cave across an enormous 300,000-year stretch of time. It showed that Denisovans were present on and off from around 250,000 years ago, all the way until as recently as 60,000 years ago, and that Neanderthals only started showing up at the same site around 200,000 years ago, carrying a distinct genetic version nobody had documented before. The truly amazing part is that researchers pulled ancient human DNA out of those dirt samples at a rate more than 10 times higher than the number of actual human fossils ever found at that site. They also found DNA from more than a dozen other types of mammals that had passed through the cave over time, including cave bears, hyenas, wolves, and even woolly mammoths, which let the team figure out which animals were most common in the cave during which specific time period. This means that under the right conditions, you do not even need to find a single bone to prove ancient humans were somewhere. You can read it straight out of the ground they once stood on, slept on, and died on. The pace of what counts as extraordinary in this field has kept speeding up ever since that original mammoth paper. In less than 2 years after the Siberian mammoth teeth broke the DNA age record, a team working in northern Greenland pushed the limit even further. They recovered environmental DNA from frozen sediment dated to roughly 2 million years old, which is currently the oldest DNA ever detected anywhere on Earth. This was not DNA from one single identifiable animal, the way the mammoth teeth were. Instead, it was a broad genetic snapshot of an entire lost ecosystem. It revealed that a landscape now covered in ice used to support forests full of mastodons, geese, lemmings, and ants, a lush Arctic environment that existed roughly 1.5 million years before the Christopha mammoth was even alive. Then in 2024, a completely different team, studying a woolly mammoth body that had naturally freeze-dried in Siberian permafrost about 52,000 years ago, found something that sounds almost like science fiction. The animal skin had preserved not just tiny fragments of DNA sequence, but the actual three-dimensional folded shape of its chromosomes, basically a frozen snapshot of how that mammoth's genetic material was physically arranged inside its own cells at the exact moment it died. To be clear here, because this discovery understandably led to a wave of over-exited cloning headlines at the time, recovering the folded shape of a chromosome is not the same thing as recovering a full living genome that could actually produce a living animal. The DNA itself is still broken into fragments and degraded, exactly the way you would expect after 52,000 years. What scientists actually gained was an incredible new window into how genes were switched on and off inside that one specific animal, not a blueprint for bringing it back to life, no matter what the more exciting headlines suggested at the time. So where does the search for the absolute oldest possible DNA go from here? The honest answer is that nobody knows yet. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this such an active, closely watched part of science right now. The theoretical limit of roughly 6 million years, set by the age of the oldest permafrost itself, is now seen as a realistic target rather than some far-off fantasy. And teams around the world are actively searching frozen ground for anything old enough to test that limit. Whether any of that future material will ever include a direct human ancestor is genuinely uncertain, and for a fairly humbling reason. Homo erectus, one of the earliest members of our own genus, first appeared roughly 8 million years ago, according to the fossil record, which is comfortably inside that theoretical preservation window. But almost every Homoctus fossil ever found has come from either the warm plains of East Africa or the humid forests and river valleys of Southeast Asia. Nowhere near the kind of permafrost that kept those mammoth teeth intact for over 1 million years. Unless a group of Homoctus happened to live, die, and get buried somewhere unusually cold at exactly the right moment in exactly the right conditions, which would admittedly be a long shot, our own most ancient genetic history may simply stay permanently out of reach. Not because scientists lack the tools to read it, but because nature simply never happened to freeze it in the first place. Which brings this whole story back around to why a story about mammoth teeth genuinely does rewrite something about the story of humanity, even though not one of those 3 teeth ever belonged to a human ancestor. It rewrote our understanding of how long genetic information can physically survive, breaking a barrier that scientists had treated as fixed for years. It proved that entirely unknown, invisible branches of a family tree, whether mammoth or human, can hide in plain sight until the right technology finally comes along to read them exactly the way Denisovans hid inside a single finger bone for tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to look closely enough. It confirmed through a mammoth hybrid that nobody expected, the exact same pattern that keeps showing up again and again in our own genetic story, that evolution is far messier, far more tangled together, and far less like a clean, simple branching tree than generations of textbooks confidently drew it. And it exposed an uncomfortable imbalance at the very heart of this whole field of science, that the frozen north has quietly kept a richer, more complete genetic record of long-extinct Arctic animals than the warm birthplace of humanity in Africa has kept of the actual ancestors who make up our own species. It is worth pausing to notice just how recent all of this really is. A little more than 10 years ago, the very idea of reading DNA older than a few 100,000 years was treated by most scientists in the field as basically impossible, a hard limit built right into the chemistry of decay itself. In that single decade, that limit has already been broken twice. First by a horse bone found in the Yukon, then by 3 mammoth teeth that had been sitting forgotten in storage since before the scientists who eventually studied them were even born, and then broken again by frozen dirt in Greenland, holding traces of an entire vanished ecosystem twice as old as any of it. Each time, the discovery did not just push the timeline back a little further. It rewrote assumptions about interbreeding, migration, and extinction that scientists had considered settled facts. There's no real reason to think that this limit has stopped moving now somewhere out there. Maybe in a drawer, or a museum freezer, or still buried in ground that nobody has thought to dig up yet. There may be a piece of bone holding a genetic record even older than Christophus. It might finally let scientists look directly at a human ancestor from over 1 million years ago, instead of piecing that story together secondhand through mammoths, horses, and dirt from a cave floor. Until that day comes, the oldest and most detailed genetic library on the entire planet keeps sitting almost entirely locked away in ice, quietly waiting for someone to notice it. Much the same way it waited inside a Swedish fridge for nearly 50 years before anyone realized exactly what they were holding.